Hi there, my name is Nate Ridgway, and welcome to my third vlog on using class time, inventively in the classroom. Today we're going to be looking at using class time to flip your classroom and hopefully transform your teaching. Now, if you've never heard of a flipped classroom, or maybe you've heard the buzzword somewhere, this is designed to kind of be a complementary source to actually doing that in your room. So if you're new to flipping, or maybe you've been an experienced flipper before, this is something that I hope can be useful to you in all circumstances. And my point here is that I'm going to be showing you how I've used class time to actually assist in flipping my classroom. Now, if you're not exactly sure what flipping a classroom is like, it's actually not too complicated. What you're basically doing is you're taking your students' in-class physical time and you're partially digitizing it so they can complete it outside of class. And that's why we call it a flipped classroom, because part of it's in class and part of it's out. Now, with that all being said, there are a lot of things that go into actually making a flipped classroom. And what I've done is I have attached a guide here to like the expectations and things that I set up with parents for that. This video is not going to go comprehensively how to actually set up a flipped classroom. Again, rather, we're going to be focusing on how you can use class time to actually assess your students while they're in this flipped experience. So, with all that being said, let's get started here. The big question that I have heard from people who have asked me why I flipped my classrooms, I have one flipped course, and that is my dual credit US history course that I teach, is that there's it's the essence for me of differentiating for my students in a way that I hadn't done before, and I can better meet their needs. And it's absolutely a fair question to ask. Like, why would I want to go through this in terms of creating both an online portal that students can interact with as well as a physical one, when they come into class. And for me, it's better able to meet their needs. I can work much more closely with students one-on-one. I also, for example, and we'll go into this more in depth here, by having them complete, let's say, a pre-assessment before class, I get a lot more time with them. That buys me 5 to 10 minutes that I would otherwise lose with those students physically. And so if you think about it, I see my kids roughly, 40 or so times a semester. 5 times 40, advanced math here, don't do it live is what they generally recommend, but that's 200 minutes of free instruction time that otherwise you would lose. And with all that being said, there's some other kind of side benefits as well. Like my students from flipping will learn skills around work ethic and self-responsibility, and lots of other things that I could go much more into detail, but for our purposes here, let's focus on class time. With class time and learning how to kind of assess your students inside and outside of class, I should probably understand why I use class time instead of some of the other apps that are out there, Socrative, Spiral, even like things like Kahoot or quizzes. And that is because in terms of how structurally class time is designed, for me, it's the one tool that I would use for flipping a classroom in terms of assessment. Now, that is not at all to say that Kahoot or Spiral or any of those other apps have a time and place, or they don't have a time and place. They absolutely do. However, for our purposes here, class time is structured in a way that works best for actually helping me flip with my students. Okay, so here's why. Let's talk about kind of the big principles here, and I've got this in the blog post, so make sure you absolutely check that out as well. Definitely for me, the philosophy when I am not only just teaching physically, but then also flipping is that less is best. And with class time, the less barriers that you can get in the way of your kids in terms of completing things, the best. And class time is really good about doing that. So although you can, I guess, create accounts on class time, your students don't have to create accounts. They don't have to log in with passwords or usernames. There are no class codes. There's no downloading files that they need to, install some kind of software. There's none of that, which is really nice. And then also, just like to help you illustrate this here, what I've done is on the blog post, I've shown you like the actual steps that my students would have to go through. I call this Miss Cheyenne's room. And then over here I have Mr. Keegan's room. And I've compared 2 apps with you. Verso is one that I've used before, and then another over here, which is the one I'm talking about now, class time. And you can see that the list for Verso and some other apps, Verso isn't just to blame here, there's a lot of steps that students would have to go through to do some of these. But with class time, For our purposes of flipping here, it's a much better option. And then 2, and this is a really, really big one, flexibility. If what you're trying to do is allow your students to have kind of a more interactive out-of-class experience, the thing that you want to do least is you want to have your students waiting on you to hit the next button so they can go to the next thing on the assessment. You don't want to have it where it's like, for example, like based on a time that students have to be on there in order to complete that particular assessment. And this is where class time is really, really nice, because what you're doing essentially is creating sessions that your students can join at any time. That makes it a lot easier and more accessible for students to actually do the flipping, because again, it's based on their time and place, and where they interact with that is kind of up to them. Now, with all that being said, you want to make sure that when you use class time, you don't enable round-based mode, and I can show you that here in a minute as well, and show you how that you want to have that turned off. But let's go, in terms of like how I've actually used class time in the room with a flipped environment. I want to show you 3 or 4 different scenarios here that I've actually come up with in terms of the actual settings that I put on sessions, and you'll see that how I set up my settings on my sessions is tailored to what I'm trying to achieve with class time when I'm flipping. Those 2 things should match. Okay, so scenario 1, formal or informal assessment at the end of a lesson. If I'm trying to do a really kind of comprehensive picture of what students know either before, or I guess I could say even before, or at the end of the lesson in particular, there's definitely some things that we want to do here. Obviously, if the students aren't in class with me, I want to make sure that I'm shuffling answers and shuffling questions to ensure test fidelity, and I'll talk about that later down below. Also, I want to make sure that they can see what they got right and what they got wrong, generally. Okay, we'll talk about some modifications you can make to that here in a second. Only 1 attempt per question, so that way they can't go back and modify their answers once they've figured out what's correct. And I also have enabled partial grading just as a part of a premium account. Okay, but there are modifications to this you can make. You could turn on the session timer if you want to give your kids a timed test that they kind of can take when they want to. There also here is this button for session reflection. And so if you're doing it this end of the lesson, a really good way to promote metacognition for those students who aren't in class with you is to turn that on and ask them to do it. And then also you could disable those show solutions immediately to hopefully crack down on some potential cheating. Okay, so here's scenario 2. You can see I have nothing checkmarked, and that is because what we're doing here with a flipped class time kind of scenario is we're brainstorming. And I'm not even going to go in when students do this and they're doing it online or they're here in class. I'm not going to validate or invalidate any answers. Now, the one cool modification that you could do to kind of like really kind of amp up the energy in your class is you could turn on this session timer, and let's say do it for a minute, and that would force your students, when prompted, to do a brain dump in 1 minute of as many ideas as they know as quick as possible. So that could be kind of a cool modification you might go and play with depending on your subject area. Okay, and then scenario number 3, and I call this one spiral. Okay, and that is because what we're going to do is we're actually going to give students the same assessment, and they're going to do it at the beginning of the lesson, and then they're going to do it at the end. And that is all, again, as I said, they're the same assessment. And what we can do is we can really see that students have grown in a particular area. They've learned something new between the time that they did that assessment before and then when they did it after. And that's really cool. The one thing that you want to make sure of that here is that you don't have the 1 attempt per question clicked, because again, students are going to go back and modify their answer, and we can really see a lot of growth doing this. And this is kind of a fun scenario that I've done when students have started the lesson and then have gone back, and I can see how they've changed their answers, which is kind of cool. Okay. Now, again, this all being said, when you decide if you're interested in, wanting to flip your classroom, or if you decide that this is something cool you might want to try in your own flipped classroom, I really encourage you to start small. Start with like a single test or a single quiz, and then kind of build up from there. Again, technology as a tool can be, for some students, really overwhelming if you just kind of throw the tools all in their face. Rather, we kind of want to use that toolbox really, really strategically with students. So last bits of advice here, and that is how can you ensure that your students are actually going to do the class time assessment if you give it to them and they're supposed to do it outside of class. Now, a lot of this obviously is going to depend on the relationships that you have built with your students. I also talk about routines and expectations in here, and I will tell you up front that I have a very honest conversation with both students and parents about what this experience is like. If you would like to check out the letter that I share with them, I've included a link right here that you can do. And then lastly, the thing I want to talk about is test fidelity. Now, obviously, there's no way that we can really prevent a student, if they want to cheat, from finding some kind of inventive way that they can do so. That being said, positive relationships, expectations, and testing procedures, and again, that goes down to kind of that overall, that kind of relationship and that kind of I guess feelings of mutual respect and or those kind of things with your kids. It's very cheesy, but the thing that I say to my dual credit U.S. history students is, you're on the trust bicycle until you fall off of it. And when they fall off of it, that's when, for example, they can't do the flipping and they have to come and take those class time assessments in class with me. But again, like there's a lot that goes into that and a lot of preparation before my students are actually ready to take that step. Now, there are some other things that you can do that in class time that will help you. Obviously, you can scramble the answer options and the order of the questions, which can help. The last thing is, you can always add in a question at the very end of your class time assessment where it's basically like an honor pledge. So, for example, I have one here that you can copy. I have neither received nor given aid on this assessment. And that can be something as simple as that students have to retype in a free response question. But past that point, that's really how I use class time to actually flip in my room. And I hope this has been kind of a helpful guide and things that you can take back immediately to your room. Be like, maybe I can give that a try. So good luck on your adventures, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.